For 26 years, the world believed it had seen everything that happened on the day Diana was laid to rest. The whole planet watched. More than 2 billion people in nearly every country on Earth sat in front of their televisions and stared at a single coffin moving slowly through the gray streets of London. They saw the flowers. They saw 2 small boys walking behind their mother's body with their heads bowed. They saw a grieving nation standing in complete silence. And they heard one man stand up inside Westminster Abbey and deliver a speech so powerful that people are still talking about it today. That man was Charles Spencer, Diana's younger brother. Everyone thought they knew that speech word for word. But what almost nobody knew, until Charles himself finally decided to say it out loud decades later, was that the words the world heard were never the words he had planned to say. And behind those words was a private promise, a secret he had carried alone about the 2 boys walking behind that coffin. This is the story he kept quiet for most of his life, and why he finally chose to tell it. To understand why this revelation shook so many people, you have to go back to the beginning, to who these 2 people really were to each other. Charles Spencer and Diana were not just brother and sister in the ordinary sense. They were the 2 youngest children in a family that had gone through its own private storms. Their parents separated when they were very young, and in a big, cold, echoing house, the 2 of them clung to each other. Charles was only 2 years old when he was already trailing after his older sister. There is a photograph, one that Charles shared with the world many years later, of the 2 of them as tiny children playing on a swing set in the garden. In it, little Charles sits gripping the chains of a swing, staring down at his own feet, while a small girl with a short blonde bob swings happily nearby on the metal bars. That little girl was Diana. Long before the cameras, before the wedding dress, before the title of Princess of Wales, she was simply his big sister in a floral outfit, laughing in a garden. Charles never forgot that version of her. Even as the entire world came to know Diana as a global icon, a fashion legend, and a humanitarian who shook the hands of AIDS patients when others were too afraid to touch them, Charles always held on to the ordinary girl he had grown up beside. Then came the summer of 1997. Diana was 36 years old at the height of her fame, adored by millions, and yet in many ways deeply alone in her position. On the last night of August, in a tunnel in Paris, a car crash tore her away from the world in an instant. The news broke across the globe in the middle of the night. People woke up to it. Strangers cried in the streets. Flowers began to pile up outside the palace gates in mountains so huge that they had to be cleared away by the truckload. And in a house far away in South Africa, where Charles Spencer was living at the time, the phone rang with the worst news a brother can ever receive. What happened next is a part of the story that Charles kept private for almost 3 decades. He has only recently begun to describe what those hours actually felt like. He had to fly back to Britain immediately, overnight, alone, across an entire continent, knowing that his sister was gone and that the whole world was watching to see what his family would do. He has since admitted that he was, in his own honest words, completely falling apart during that flight. He was not a public performer flying home to give a grand speech. He was a broken younger brother, crying on a plane, being quietly comforted by a kind flight attendant who could see the state he was in. That is the real human being behind the composed, dignified man the cameras would show the world a few days later. He arrived home shattered, and yet he knew that within days he would have to stand up in front of the entire planet and find something to say about the sister he had just lost. This is where the secret begins. Everyone assumed that the famous eulogy, the speech that made headlines around the world, the speech that was so bold it reportedly caused a stir even inside the royal family, had been carefully prepared over many days. People imagined Charles laboring over every sentence, polishing each line. But that is not what happened at all. According to Charles himself, the speech the world eventually heard was written in roughly 90 minutes. An hour and a half. That was all. And more surprising still, it was completely different from the eulogy he had originally intended to give. For years, Charles had a first version in his mind, a very different speech as he later described it. But in the raw, grief-soaked hours before the funeral, something shifted inside him. He came to a realization that changed everything about what he would say. He understood in that moment that his job was not to stand up and talk about Diana as if she were a subject to be praised from a distance. His job, he decided, was to speak for her, to become her voice now that she no longer had won. To say the things she might have wanted said, to protect what she had loved, and to stand guard over the people she had left behind. That single shift, from speaking about his sister to speaking for his sister, is the reason the eulogy landed the way it did. It did not sound like a polite tribute. It sounded like a brother defending his sister to the entire world. And at the very heart of that decision was the secret promise. As Charles stood there preparing to speak, his mind was fixed on two people above all others, the two boys who would be walking behind the coffin, his nephews, Diana's sons. He has since revealed that in that terrible moment, he felt that his sister had left him something more important than any inheritance. He felt she had left him as a guardian of her boys. He knew, of course, that this had no legal weight whatsoever. He was fully aware that the boys had a living parent and a powerful family around them, and that in the eyes of the law his feeling meant nothing at all. But it meant everything to him. In his heart, he had accepted a duty that no court had given him and no document had written down. He silently took on the role of the uncle who would always be watching over Diana's children, standing in her corner, ready to speak up for them the way she no longer could. That is the private promise he carried into Westminster Abbey. That is the secret weight behind every sentence of that famous speech. When the day of the funeral finally came, the scale of the grief was almost impossible to describe. The streets of London were lined with people standing many rows deep, some who had slept overnight on the pavement just to be there. The silence was the thing that struck everyone the most, a strange, heavy silence broken only by the sound of the horses' hooves and the wheels of the gun carriage carrying the coffin. On top of that coffin sat white flowers and a small card. Behind it walked a line of men that the world will never forget. Diana's former husband, her father-in-law, and the two young princes, walking slowly with their heads down, being watched by billions. And among them walked Charles Spencer, the brother, carrying his private grief and his private promise all at once. Inside the ancient walls of Westminster Abbey, when the moment came, Charles rose and walked to the lectern. What he delivered was unlike anything people expected at a royal funeral. It was tender and loving toward his sister, painting her as a genuinely warm and human person rather than a distant icon. But it was also unflinching. He spoke plainly about the pressures that had surrounded her, and he made a clear vow on behalf of her family that they would continue to guide her sons and protect the parts of them that were most like their mother. It was a speech with steel in it. When he finished, something extraordinary happened. The sound of applause began outside the Abbey, from the enormous crowds listening to loudspeakers in the parks and streets. That applause rolled toward the building and then washed inside it, until the people within the Abbey itself began to clap too. It was a moment almost without precedent, and it told everyone watching just how deeply his words had struck the heart of the nation. For years afterward, that was where the public story ended. The speech was famous. The moment was legendary. But Charles kept the story behind the story to himself. It was only much later in his life, sitting down for a calm and reflective conversation on a podcast, that he finally began to open the door on what had really been going on inside him during those days. He revealed that the polished, powerful eulogy people remembered had actually been born out of chaos, grief, and a last-minute change of heart. He revealed that he had even removed one section from the speech before delivering it, a pointed reference aimed at a powerful media figure, because on reflection he decided it was unnecessary and did not belong there. He wanted the focus to stay on his sister, not on settling scores. That small detail, kept quiet for decades, showed just how carefully he had weighed every word even while barely holding himself together. Why did he finally decide to speak? Part of the answer seems to lie in the simple passage of time. Nearly 3 decades have now passed since Diana's death. Charles himself is in his 60s. He has spent those years as the keeper of her memory in the most literal way possible. He lives at Althorpe, the sprawling family estate where he and Diana grew up together, the same grounds where that childhood swing set once stood. And it is there, on a quiet, tree-lined island in the middle of a lake on that estate, that Diana is buried. Her final resting place is not a public monument in a busy city. It is a peaceful, private island on the land of her childhood, watched over by the little brother who once chased after her through the gardens. Every year on the anniversary of her death, he shares glimpses of the flowers left in her memory. Every so often, he shares another rare photograph of the sister the world lost too soon. He has become, in a very real sense, the guardian he silently promised to be, not only of her children, but of her memory itself. When asked all these years later how he copes with the loss after nearly 3 decades, Charles gave an answer that was quietly devastating in its honesty. He said that trauma of this kind never truly leaves a family. Instead, he explained, a person simply gets used to living alongside it. The pain does not vanish. You do not get over it. You just learn to carry it day after day, year after year, until it becomes a permanent part of who you are. Coming from a man who has spent almost 30 years walking past his sister's grave on his own land, those words carry a weight that few people could ever fully understand. And this is what made his revelation land so hard with so many people. It was not a scandal. It was not a shocking accusation. It was something far more powerful and far more human. It was the truth that behind the most watched funeral in history, behind the most famous eulogy of a generation, there was a grieving younger brother who wrote his speech in 90 minutes on the edge of collapse, who tore up his first draft, who chose to become his sister's voice, and who made a silent, legally meaningless, deeply personal vow to look after her two boys for the rest of his life. The nation had watched him be strong in public. What they never saw was how much that strength had cost him, and what he had privately promised in the middle of his own heartbreak. That is the secret Charles Spencer carried for the best part of 30 years. Not a hidden scandal, but a hidden promise. And when he finally said it out loud, it reminded the whole world of something easy to forget beneath all the fame and all the headlines. Before Diana was a princess, before she was an icon, before she belonged to the public, she was somebody's big sister. And her little brother never stopped protecting her, not on the day of her funeral, and not on any of the 10,000 days that have passed since. He is still standing guard over her memory today, on a quiet island, on the land where they were once just two children on a swing.